No warrior in the north had ever seen the Alpha King freeze in a doorway, until the night he found 3 royal pups sleeping peacefully on top of a stranger. Snow drifted through the towering pines of Blackwood Forest, covering the narrow trail with a blanket of silver that reflected the moonlight like scattered glass. King Lucian Blackwood had tracked the scent of his missing pups for nearly 24 endless hours, and every passing mile had tightened the weight pressing against his chest. His guard stayed several steps behind him, silent for the first time in years. No one dared interrupt a father searching for his children. The fresh paw prints ended at the mouth of an old den hidden beneath a rocky hillside where twisted roots curled over the entrance like protective hands. A faint glow flickered inside. Someone had built a fire. Lucian slowly rested one hand against the rough stone wall before stepping through the narrow opening. The scent reached him first. Warm broth, fresh pine, wild lavender. Then he saw them. 3 tiny wolf pups, each one carrying the unmistakable silver markings of the royal bloodline, were sleeping soundly in the soft glow of the fire. Their fur had been carefully brushed clean. Their little bellies rose and fell with slow, contented breaths instead of the frightened shivers he had imagined all night. The smallest pup had both front paws draped across the arm of a young woman who had fallen asleep sitting against the cave wall. Another rested across her lap. The oldest had curled against her shoulder, using her worn wool cloak as if it were the safest bed in the world. The woman herself looked exhausted. Loose strands of pale blonde hair framed a peaceful face still touched by traces of dirt from the frozen trail outside. One hand rested protectively beside the pups even in sleep, as though she had promised herself nothing would reach them before morning. Beside the dying fire sat a battered cooking pot, with the last spoonful of rabbit stew still warm enough to steam into the cold air. Tiny wooden bowls had been washed and stacked neatly beside it. Small blankets made from patched fabric had been sewn together with careful stitches that could only have taken hours. Lucian stood perfectly still. Every frightening possibility he had imagined dissolved into quiet disbelief. His children hated strangers. They barely tolerated palace servants. Since losing their mother more than a year earlier, they trusted almost no one beyond their father. Yet here they slept without fear, piled together around a woman he had never seen before. One of his guards cautiously approached the entrance before stopping at the sight inside. No orders came. No accusations. No raised voices. Even the forest outside seemed to hold its breath. The little gray pup stirred first. His ears twitched before sleepy blue eyes blinked open. He looked toward the towering Alpha King, standing only a few feet away. For a heartbeat, Lucian expected panic. Instead, the pup yawned lazily, stretched one tiny paw, then snuggled even closer against the sleeping woman's side with a satisfied sigh. Lucian's expression softened in a way no council member had witnessed in years. Something impossible had happened inside this forgotten den. Someone had given his children a single peaceful night when an entire kingdom had failed. He lowered himself carefully onto one knee, afraid even the smallest movement might wake them too soon. His gaze lingered on the woman whose face carried quiet kindness even in exhaustion. She looked no older than 23. Her boots were worn thin. Her cloak had been mended so many times the original fabric was almost impossible to recognize. Yet every detail surrounding the pups spoke of patience instead of desperation. Someone who had almost nothing had somehow chosen to give everything she could to 3 frightened little souls she did not even know. Lucian had spent years judging strength by courage in battle, by authority, by loyalty sworn beneath the moon. Tonight, inside a forgotten shelter hidden beneath snow and stone, another kind of strength rested before him with closed eyes and tired hands. He did not yet know her name. He did not know why fate had brought her into his children's path. But for the first time since dawn, the Alpha King allowed himself one quiet breath of hope, unaware that by sunrise, the entire Blackwood pack would accuse the sleeping stranger of a crime she had never imagined, and the peaceful silence inside the den would become the center of a storm that would change every life it touched forever. The quiet inside the den lasted only a few more seconds before the smallest pup stretched again and lifted his sleepy head. His bright blue eyes blinked toward King Lucian, then drifted back to the young woman whose arm rested protectively beside him. Instead of running to his father, the little pup nudged Evelyn Carter's hand with his nose, searching for the comfort he had found throughout the long winter night. The gentle movement finally stirred her awake. Evelyn inhaled softly as her eyes fluttered open, still clouded by exhaustion. For one peaceful heartbeat, she smiled at the tiny wolves gathered around her, forgetting where she was and forgetting how lonely the previous day had been. Then she noticed the enormous shadow standing between her and the entrance. Her smile vanished. Golden eyes met silver ones across the glowing fire. Lucian remained perfectly still, allowing her to see him clearly before speaking. His heavy dark cloak carried fresh snow across the shoulders, and the silver crest of Blackwood rested over his chest. Every child in the Northern Territories knew that crest. Every adult feared it. Evelyn immediately understood who stood before her. Color drained from her face. She carefully lifted the oldest pup from her shoulder and slowly stood, making certain not to frighten the others. Her boots scraped lightly against the stone floor. She lowered her eyes respectfully. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "I did not know they belonged to you." She expected anger. She expected soldiers to rush forward and accuse her of stealing the royal heirs. Instead, silence filled the cave once again. Lucian studied every small detail surrounding him. The blankets had been folded with care. Fresh water sat in a wooden bowl within easy reach of the pups. Pieces of dried venison had been cut into tiny bites suitable for young teeth. Even the floor had been covered with dry pine needles beneath the blankets to keep the cold from reaching them through the stone. None of these things happened by accident. They required patience, time, compassion. His guards exchanged uncertain glances behind him. One finally stepped closer and quietly said, "Your Majesty, we should return the young ones to the palace immediately." Before Lucian could answer, the oldest pup climbed to his feet and walked directly toward Evelyn instead of the waiting guards. The little wolf leaned gently against her leg and looked up with complete trust. The second pup copied him only moments later. The smallest one stumbled after his siblings, letting out a tiny whine until Evelyn instinctively bent down and gathered him into her arms. She froze the instant she realized what she had done. "I am sorry," she said quickly. He looked frightened. Lucian watched the tiny wolf settle comfortably against her shoulder. His son was not frightened. He was peaceful. It was an expression Lucian had almost forgotten existed. After the death of their mother, every night inside the palace had become a struggle. The pups often woke from restless dreams, refusing food, refusing comfort, refusing nearly everyone around them. Yet here, after only a single night with a stranger, they looked healthier than they had in weeks. Lucian finally spoke, his deep voice calm enough to surprise everyone present. "Did you know who they were?" Evelyn shook her head immediately. "No, Your Majesty. I found them near the frozen creek yesterday afternoon. They were cold, hungry, and alone. I thought their mother would return, so I waited. When darkness came and no one appeared, I brought them here because I could not leave them outside." She hesitated before quietly adding, "Any child deserves warmth." Those simple words echoed through the den more powerfully than any formal speech. Lucian noticed her empty bowl resting beside the fire. There was only enough stew left for the pups. She had clearly gone without. "Did you eat?" he asked. Evelyn looked away for only a moment before answering honestly. "They needed it more than I did." One of the guards frowned with disbelief, unable to understand why anyone with so little would willingly give away the last of her food. Lucian understood something else entirely. Kindness offered without expectation carried a strength that could not be commanded by rank or earned through fear. As the first rays of morning slipped through the entrance, golden light spread across the sleeping den, revealing the simple truth no title could disguise. The royal pups had chosen the person they trusted most. Outside, however, voices began to echo through the forest. More members of the Blackwood pack were approaching, and their hurried footsteps carried certainty instead of curiosity. They had already decided what story they intended to believe, and before the morning sun climbed above the snow-covered pines, Evelyn would discover that sometimes the greatest danger did not come from the wilderness, but from people who judged before they listened. The voices outside grew louder with every passing second until figures began appearing between the snow-covered trees. Hunters, elders, servants, and curious members of the Blackwood pack gathered near the entrance of the den, whispering to one another before any of them had seen what waited inside. Rumors always traveled faster than truth. Someone claimed the royal pups had been stolen. Someone else insisted a rogue wolf had lured them away. Others simply wanted someone to blame for the fear that had gripped the kingdom since the children disappeared. Evelyn remained where she stood, still holding the smallest pup against her shoulder. She wanted to place him gently beside his father, but every time she lowered him, the tiny wolf wrapped both front paws around her sleeve and refused to let go. The oldest pup stepped in front of her boots as though guarding her without understanding why. The middle pup settled quietly against her side, his tail brushing the edge of her cloak. None of them looked frightened. They looked as though they had already decided where they belonged. Murmurs spread through the gathering crowd as the first members of the pack peered inside. Their surprise lasted only a moment before suspicion replaced it. An elderly council member narrowed his eyes. "She trapped them," he declared before anyone asked a single question. No ordinary Omega could persuade royal heirs to stay willingly. Another voice quickly followed. "She planned this from the beginning. She wanted the king's attention. She should answer for what she has done." The accusations piled together so quickly that they sounded like one endless wave crashing through the quiet morning air. Evelyn lowered her head. She had heard voices like these before. Months earlier, they had followed her through village streets after a merchant falsely accused her of taking bread she had actually paid for. Before that, neighbors blamed her whenever livestock wandered away from their fences, even though she spent most of her days helping injured animals return home. She had learned that once enough people believed the same story, the truth often became invisible. King Lucian listened without interrupting. His face revealed nothing. His guards waited for orders that never came. Instead of watching the crowd, Lucian continued watching the pups. Action spoke more honestly than frightened witnesses ever could. One of the council members stepped toward Evelyn and extended both hands. "Bring the youngest prince here," he demanded. Evelyn carefully loosened the tiny wolf's paws from her sleeve. "It is all right," she whispered softly. "Your family is here." She gently offered him forward. The little pup looked at the elder for only an instant before twisting away, burying his face against Evelyn's shoulder once again. A ripple of surprise spread through the crowd. The elder frowned and tried again, speaking more sweetly this time. The pup refused even to look at him. Another palace servant approached with a favorite blanket taken from the nursery. Normally, the youngest prince never slept without it. Today, he ignored the blanket completely and reached one tiny paw toward Evelyn's face instead. She smiled without thinking and scratched gently behind one small ear. His tail immediately began wagging. Lucian noticed every detail. Trust could not be commanded. It had to be earned. Beside him, Captain Rowan quietly spoke. "Your Majesty, I have protected the princes since the day they were born. I have never seen them accept anyone this quickly." Lucian nodded almost imperceptibly. "Neither have I." The oldest pup suddenly walked across the cave floor toward his father. Hope briefly brightened several faces in the crowd. At last, they thought, the children would return. The young wolf stopped directly in front of Lucian, looked up into his father's eyes, then turned around and walked back to Evelyn, sitting neatly against her boots before glancing toward the king once more as though inviting him to understand something that words could not explain. Lucian felt a quiet ache inside his chest. His son was not choosing between them. He was trying to bring them together. The realization settled over him with unexpected warmth. Whatever kindness had filled this lonely den throughout the previous night had reached his children in ways the grand halls of the palace no longer could. Outside, however, the crowd continued growing larger. Fear had begun transforming into judgment, and judgment was becoming something far more dangerous. Lucian understood that before this morning ended, he would not only decide the fate of a forgotten young woman named Evelyn Carter. He would decide whether his kingdom would continue following fear or finally learn to recognize quiet goodness when it stood right before their eyes. The cold morning air grew heavier as more members of the Blackwood pack surrounded the entrance of the den. Snow crunched beneath dozens of boots, and quiet conversations blended into a restless murmur that rolled through the forest like an approaching storm. Evelyn could feel every pair of eyes settling on her. She had experienced judgment before, but never from so many people at once. Still, she kept one gentle hand resting on the smallest pup's back, soothing him with slow, steady strokes because his comfort mattered more to her than the whispers outside. King Lucian finally stepped forward, and the crowd immediately fell silent. His presence carried the quiet authority of someone who never needed to raise his voice. He looked first at the three pups, then at Evelyn, before speaking with calm certainty. No one will make accusations until the truth has been heard. The words should have settled the gathering, but fear often ignored reason. Elder Marcus, the oldest advisor in the pack, bowed respectfully before answering. Your Majesty, every moment this stranger remains beside the royal heirs places them at unnecessary risk. She is an unknown Omega with no witnesses to support her story. Several heads nodded in agreement. Evelyn lowered her eyes. She understood their suspicion even if it wounded her. She had no family standing beside her. No respected elder would defend her. Her cottage had been taken months ago after she failed to pay taxes during a brutal winter, leaving her to survive alone by gathering herbs, sewing clothing for travelers, and helping injured woodland creatures whenever she found them. None of those quiet acts earned recognition. They simply became part of another forgotten day. Lucian noticed the patched elbows on her coat and the careful stitches repairing worn leather gloves that had clearly lasted through many winters. Nothing about her suggested someone seeking wealth or influence. Everything about her reflected quiet endurance. Captain Rowan stepped inside the den carrying a small woven basket discovered near the fire. Your Majesty, he said, placing it gently on a flat stone. Inside rested bundles of dried herbs, sewing needles wrapped in cloth, a spool of faded blue thread, and several pieces of homemade bread that had gone untouched. Rowan looked surprised. These are all her belongings. Evelyn smiled faintly with embarrassment. The bread became stale yesterday, she admitted softly. I thought it would be better soaked in the stew for the little ones. Another silence followed. Even those eager to judge found themselves studying the nearly empty basket. There was no treasure hidden beneath the cloth. No stolen jewelry. No sign of preparation for escape. Only simple possessions belonging to someone who had learned to live with very little. The middle pup suddenly wandered toward the basket, sniffed the remaining piece of bread, then carried it back to Evelyn, dropping it carefully into her hands. She laughed quietly, brushing a loose strand of blonde hair behind one ear. Thank you, she whispered, breaking off a small piece before offering the rest back to him. Instead of eating it himself, the little wolf nudged the bread toward his brother. Lucian watched the exchange with growing wonder. They were sharing because she had taught them to share. In only one night, compassion had become their first instinct. The realization settled deeply inside him. The palace tutors had spent months teaching proper manners without reaching the children's hearts. Evelyn had done it simply by living the example herself. Outside the den, several mothers from the village had quietly arrived after hearing the news. They peered through the entrance and exchanged uncertain glances. One finally spoke just above a whisper. Look at the children. They are smiling. Another nodded slowly. They have not smiled since the queen passed. Those gentle observations spread through the crowd far more quietly than the earlier accusations, yet they carried unexpected weight. People began looking less at Evelyn herself and more at the peaceful expressions on the pups' faces. Fear slowly gave way to curiosity. Elder Marcus sensed the changing mood and spoke again. Your Majesty, appearances can deceive. Lucian turned toward him with steady eyes. They can, he replied. That is exactly why I intend to learn the whole truth before I judge anyone. As sunlight filtered through the tall pines, illuminating the entrance of the humble den, Evelyn realized this was the first time in many months that someone with power had chosen to listen before deciding her worth. She did not know whether that chance would save her, but it awakened something she thought had disappeared forever. Hope. Neither she nor the gathering crowd realized that before the day ended, the Alpha King would ask a single question that would uncover a hidden piece of Evelyn's past, and the answer would begin changing not only her future, but the future of the entire Blackwood Kingdom. King Lucian allowed the silence to linger after his final words because silence often revealed more than arguments ever could. The crowd outside shifted uneasily, waiting for an immediate judgment that never arrived. Instead, the Alpha King slowly walked farther into the den until he stood beside the simple fire that had kept his children warm through the night. He crouched near the stone hearth and noticed something he had overlooked before. 3 small wooden cups rested in a neat line beside the cooking pot. Each one carried a tiny mark carved into the side. A crescent moon, a pine tree, a little star. The carvings were uneven, clearly made by inexperienced hands. Yet each symbol matched the favorite story one of the pups had eagerly listened to before falling asleep. Lucian glanced toward Evelyn. They carved these. She nodded quietly. The oldest wanted everyone to have their own cup. They laughed every time the shapes became crooked. One of the palace servants stared in disbelief. They have never touched carving tools before. Evelyn looked surprised. Children learn quickly when someone believes they can. Her answer settled gently into the hearts of several villagers standing near the entrance. Mothers exchanged thoughtful looks. Fathers lowered their eyes. The smallest moments often revealed the greatest truths. Lucian picked up the cup marked with the tiny star. Its rough edges still carried fresh traces of pine. His youngest son happily wagged his tail the instant he recognized it. The little wolf bounded toward the king, touched the cup with one paw, then looked back at Evelyn with bright eyes, inviting her to smile as though sharing a treasured memory. She smiled without hesitation. "You worked very hard on that one," she said softly. The pup puffed out his tiny chest with obvious pride. Lucian had not seen that expression in months. Since the loss of their mother, the palace had become painfully quiet. Toys remained untouched. Lessons ended early. Laughter had nearly disappeared from its halls. Yet inside a forgotten den, surrounded by patched blankets and simple kindness, joy had quietly returned. Captain Rowan stepped beside the king and lowered his voice. "Your Majesty, perhaps the children should return to the palace before the weather worsens." Lucian looked toward the bright morning sky beyond the trees. The storm had passed. The greater danger no longer came from snow. It came from misunderstanding. He rose to his full height before facing Evelyn once more. "Will you tell me your story?" She hesitated, not because she wished to hide anything, but because she was no longer certain anyone truly wanted to hear it. After taking a slow breath, she began. She spoke of losing her parents years earlier to illness. She spoke of earning a modest living by sewing torn clothing, gathering medicinal herbs, and helping anyone who needed an extra pair of hands, whether they could repay her or not. She described the winter that ruined the harvest, forcing many families into hardship. When she could no longer pay the yearly tax on her tiny cottage, she surrendered it without protest rather than see another struggling family burdened by her debt. She never mentioned injustice. She never blamed anyone. She simply described each event as though it were another season that had come and gone. The crowd listened more quietly with every passing sentence. There was no bitterness in her voice, only honesty. Elder Marcus frowned, searching for some hidden contradiction, but every nearby villager slowly began recalling forgotten moments. One woman remembered Evelyn staying through an entire night to care for her feverish daughter. An elderly woodcutter remembered finding fresh bread left anonymously outside his cabin after breaking his leg. A young shepherd quietly admitted that someone had repaired his winter coat without accepting payment. One memory led to another until the whispers changing hands were no longer accusations, but acts of kindness people had overlooked because they happened without expectation of reward. Lucian realized something remarkable. Evelyn had become almost invisible precisely because she never asked for recognition. She simply helped, then quietly moved on. The three pups suddenly gathered around her once again. The oldest gently slipped his tiny paw into her hand. The middle pup leaned comfortably against her leg. The youngest reached upward until she lifted him into her arms without thinking. No command had brought them together. No promise of reward. Only trust. Lucian understood then that children possessed a rare gift adults often lost. They recognized sincere hearts before titles, appearances, or rumors could cloud their judgment. As sunlight poured through the entrance, warming the stone floor where fear had stood only an hour earlier, the Alpha King reached a decision that surprised even himself. He looked directly at Evelyn and spoke with quiet certainty. "I believe there is more your presence can offer my family than this forest ever could." Before she could answer, a royal messenger emerged breathlessly from the trail, carrying an ivory-sealed scroll from the palace. The message had arrived too late to prevent the search, but its contents would reveal an unexpected truth about the royal nursery that would make Lucian's invitation impossible to refuse. The royal messenger stopped only a few feet from King Lucian before lowering to one knee, and presenting the ivory-sealed scroll with both hands. Frost still clung to his cloak, and his breathing remained uneven after riding through the forest without rest. Lucian broke the seal and quietly read the message while every eye waited for his reaction. His expression remained composed, but when he reached the final line, he slowly folded the parchment and looked toward his children. The message confirmed what the palace physicians had been unable to explain for months. Since the passing of the queen, the three young heirs had refused nearly every caretaker assigned to them. They barely slept through the night. They often left their meals untouched. Several experienced nurses had resigned in tears after believing they had failed the royal family. Yet after one single evening with Evelyn, every problem described in the report had quietly disappeared. The children had eaten well. They had rested peacefully. They had laughed. Lucian slipped the scroll into his coat and stepped closer to Evelyn. "There is something you should know," he said. She listened without lifting her eyes. "The palace has searched for someone who could bring my children peace. We believed we needed more training, more guards, more rules. Instead, they found comfort in someone who offered none of those things." Evelyn looked down at the little wolves gathered around her. "I only treated them the way I would have wanted someone to treat me." Those simple words carried no pride, only sincerity. Lucian nodded slowly. Perhaps that is exactly what they needed. Elder Marcus took one step forward. "Your Majesty, surely you are not considering bringing an unknown woman into the royal household." Several council members quietly agreed. The Alpha King turned toward them with calm confidence. "I am considering bringing kindness into my children's lives." No one answered immediately. The statement was impossible to argue against without sounding unreasonable. Even so, uncertainty remained written across many faces. Trust could not be rebuilt in a single morning. Lucian understood that. He also understood something equally important. Fear had ruled his kingdom for too long. The oldest pup suddenly tugged gently at Evelyn's sleeve before walking toward the entrance of the den. He looked back several times, encouraging her to follow. The middle pup happily joined him. The youngest reached both tiny paws toward Evelyn until she carefully carried him outside. Fresh sunlight spilled across the snow, making the entire clearing sparkle beneath the winter sky. The children immediately began exploring the untouched blanket of snow together. The oldest shaped a small snowball with his paws before nudging it toward his younger brother. The middle pup laughed and rolled it farther. The youngest clapped excitedly from Evelyn's arms until she gently set him down beside the others. Within moments, all three were playing together beneath the towering pine trees. Mothers standing among the crowd smiled through misty eyes. Several quietly admitted they had not witnessed such carefree happiness since the queen had been alive. Lucian watched from a short distance, allowing himself a rare moment simply to be a father instead of a ruler. Captain Rowan stepped beside him. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "they are different today." Lucian never looked away from the children. "No," he answered after a thoughtful pause. "They are finally themselves again." Rowan followed his gaze toward Evelyn, who knelt in the snow helping the youngest pup stack tiny pine cones into a crooked little tower. She laughed when it tipped over, and the three children laughed with her. There was no performance in the moment, no effort to impress anyone. Only genuine warmth shared between lonely hearts that had unexpectedly found one another. Lucian realized that every great hall in his palace, every priceless tapestry, and every carefully prepared banquet had failed to create what existed naturally in this quiet forest clearing. Home was not built from stone. It was built from the feeling of being safe enough to smile. As the joyful sounds echoed through the trees, the Alpha King made a decision that would surprise the entire kingdom. He walked toward Evelyn, stopped only a few feet away, and spoke clearly enough for everyone gathered to hear. "Evelyn Carter, I would like you to come to Blackwood Palace as an honored guest. Not because you owe my family anything, but because my children have already shown me where they feel most at peace." A stunned silence settled across the clearing. Before Evelyn could gather the courage to answer, the three young pups ran together toward Lucian, then turned at the same moment and hurried back to stand beside her, as though making their own answer known before she ever spoke a single word. For several long moments, Evelyn could not find her voice. She looked from the three joyful pups to the Alpha King, convinced she had misunderstood what he had said. No one had ever invited her anywhere as an honored guest. Most doors had quietly closed the moment people recognized her name. She lowered her gaze and answered with gentle honesty. Your Majesty, I am grateful beyond words, but I do not belong in a palace. Lucian studied her expression carefully. There was no false humility in her answer. She truly believed she belonged nowhere near the life he offered. Before he could respond, Elder Marcus stepped forward once more. Your Majesty, forgive my persistence, but tradition exists for a reason. The royal household cannot simply welcome an unknown Omega because 3 children have grown fond of her. Several council members murmured their agreement. Lucian remained calm. Tradition should protect what is valuable, he replied. It should never prevent us from recognizing it. His words echoed through the snowy clearing, leaving the gathering unusually quiet. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention. She had never wanted to become the center of anyone's debate. The youngest pup gently tugged at the edge of her sleeve again, as though reminding her she was not standing alone. She looked down and smiled, brushing a few snowflakes from his soft silver fur. The oldest pup wandered over to Lucian, then turned and placed one tiny paw against Evelyn's boot before looking back at his father with hopeful eyes. Even the middle pup repeated the same gentle gesture, standing between them as though building an invisible bridge. Captain Rowan noticed it first. They are asking for both of you, he said quietly. Lucian nodded. He understood exactly what his children were trying to express. They were not choosing between the woman who had comforted them and the father who loved them. They wanted both to remain close. A faint breeze carried the scent of pine through the clearing as the morning sun climbed higher above the forest. Villagers who had arrived expecting to witness punishment now found themselves watching something entirely different. They saw 3 royal children refusing to leave the side of a woman who had asked for nothing in return. They saw an alpha king listening before judging. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, hearts that had been hardened by fear began to soften. An elderly woman stepped out from the crowd. Lucian recognized her as Martha, a respected village baker. She bowed politely before speaking. Your Majesty, I have known Evelyn since she was a little girl. She brought fresh herbs to my husband every week during his illness. She never accepted payment. Another villager stepped forward. She repaired my daughter's winter coat after the last blizzard. Then another voice followed. She found my lost hunting dog 2 summers ago. One memory led naturally to another until the clearing filled with quiet stories that had never been told because Evelyn had never spoken about them herself. She stood speechless, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. Please, she said softly. I only did what anyone should do. Martha smiled kindly. Perhaps, but you were often the only one who actually did. Lucian watched the exchange with thoughtful eyes. Leadership had taught him that reputation could be shaped by the loudest voices. Character, however, revealed itself through countless quiet choices made when no one was watching. Evelyn had never tried to build a reputation. She had simply built a life guided by compassion. The Alpha King stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. Evelyn, he said, speaking her name for the first time without title or distance. I am not asking you to become someone different. I am asking you to remain exactly who you already are. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. For the first time that morning, she did not see only a powerful ruler. She saw a father searching for hope after a season of grief. She glanced at the 3 pups playing happily in the snow. Their bright laughter drifted through the forest with a warmth that seemed impossible only hours earlier. Her heart quietly surrendered to the truth she had tried to resist. Leaving them behind would hurt almost as much as leaving them had frightened them the day before. She drew a slow breath and gave the smallest nod. If my presence truly helps them, she said, then I will come. Before anyone else could react, the 3 pups raced through the snow toward her at once. The oldest wrapped both tiny paws around her leg. The middle pup spun excitedly in circles until snow scattered into the sunlight. The youngest reached upward with complete confidence, certain she would lift him. She did. The clearing filled with gentle laughter, even from people who had arrived determined to doubt her. Yet standing near the back of the gathering, one silent figure quietly turned away and disappeared into the trees. Hidden beneath a dark traveling cloak, the stranger carried a calculating expression, already planning how to use Evelyn's unexpected place within the royal family for purposes that had nothing to do with kindness. The journey to Blackwood Palace began before noon, with fresh snow sparkling beneath the bright winter sun. A royal carriage had been prepared for Evelyn, but she hesitated before climbing inside. She had never ridden in one before, and the polished wood, warm blankets, and embroidered cushions felt as though they belonged to someone else's life. King Lucian noticed her uncertainty and quietly opened the carriage door himself. "You are our guest," he said with a gentle smile. "There is no reason to feel out of place." Evelyn nodded gratefully and stepped inside, but before she could settle into her seat, the three young pups bounded after her without waiting for permission. The oldest curled up beside her feet. The middle pup rested his head against her knee. The youngest climbed directly into her lap with complete confidence, earning a soft laugh from both Evelyn and several nearby guards. Lucian entered last, taking the seat across from them. As the carriage rolled away from the forest, he watched his children more than the passing landscape. They looked peaceful. They looked safe. Most of all, they looked like children again instead of little souls carrying grief far too heavy for their age. The ride through the kingdom revealed quiet villages blanketed in snow, frozen rivers reflecting the afternoon light, and fields waiting patiently for spring. Whenever the carriage slowed through a town, people gathered along the road to greet their king. Many bowed respectfully, but their attention quickly shifted toward the unfamiliar young woman traveling with the royal family. Curious whispers followed the carriage long after it passed. Evelyn lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with the attention, but the oldest pup gently nudged her hand until she looked up again. She smiled at him, and he answered with a cheerful wag of his tail, as though reminding her she no longer needed to face uncertain moments alone. By late afternoon, the towers of Blackwood Palace appeared beyond the snow-covered hills. Built from pale gray stone, the castle stood proudly above the valley, surrounded by towering evergreens and crystal-clear lakes frozen beneath the winter sky. It was magnificent, yet strangely quiet. Lucian understood why. Since the queen's passing, laughter had almost disappeared from those halls. As the carriage entered the palace courtyard, servants lined both sides of the entrance. Some looked curious, others looked doubtful. A few exchanged cautious glances after recognizing Evelyn's worn cloak and simple boots. They had expected a noble guest, not a humble young woman carrying little more than a small woven basket. Before anyone could whisper too loudly, the youngest pup leaped happily from the carriage and immediately reached back toward Evelyn. She accepted his tiny paw without thinking, helping him carefully onto the stone steps. The middle pup followed, staying close to her side. The oldest walked proudly between Evelyn and Lucian as though introducing them to the palace together. The quiet display did not escape anyone's notice. Inside the grand entrance hall, towering windows filled the room with soft golden light. Marble floors reflected the glow of hundreds of candles. Beautiful paintings of generations past covered the walls, each telling stories of powerful alpha rulers and great victories. Evelyn instinctively slowed her steps. She felt impossibly small surrounded by such grandeur. Lucian noticed and spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "Do not measure yourself against these walls. They have stood here for centuries. Kindness does not need a palace to become extraordinary." His words eased the tension she had carried since leaving the forest. The royal housekeeper, Eleanor Ashford, approached with perfect composure. She had served the palace faithfully for more than 30 years and rarely showed surprise. Yet even she paused after seeing the three royal pups surrounding Evelyn instead of rushing toward familiar servants. Eleanor bowed respectfully to the king before offering a warm smile to Evelyn. "Welcome to Blackwood Palace," she said. "Any friend trusted by these children deserves a fair welcome here." Several servants exchanged surprised looks. Eleanor's opinion carried great weight throughout the household. If she welcomed the newcomer, others would think carefully before speaking against her. Lucian thanked the housekeeper before asking her to prepare a comfortable guest room overlooking the eastern gardens. Evelyn immediately shook her head. "Your Majesty, a small room near the servants would be more than enough." Lucian smiled patiently. "You continue proving why my invitation was the right decision." Before Evelyn could answer, cheerful laughter echoed through the grand hall. The youngest pup had discovered his favorite wooden ball abandoned beneath a staircase. Instead of keeping it for himself, he proudly carried it back to Evelyn and placed it in her hands, waiting for her to throw it across the polished floor. She did, and all three pups happily chased after it together, their joyful voices filling the palace with a sound many servants realized they had not heard in many months. Standing silently along the upper balcony, a finely dressed noblewoman watched the scene unfold with narrowed eyes. She had expected the royal household to remain exactly as it had been after the queen's passing. Seeing the children laughing beside an unknown Omega unsettled every plan she had quietly nurtured, and as she turned away without being noticed, she resolved that Evelyn Carter would soon discover that winning the hearts of three children was far easier than winning acceptance inside the palace itself. The days that followed brought quiet changes no one inside Blackwood Palace could ignore. Each morning the three young heirs hurried through the halls searching for Evelyn before breakfast. They insisted she join them in the palace gardens, where snow slowly melted beneath the first hints of approaching spring. Together they planted tiny evergreen seedlings beside the stone pathways, baked simple honey bread in the royal kitchens, and filled once silent rooms with laughter that echoed beneath the high ceilings. Servants who had once watched Evelyn with uncertainty gradually discovered that she thanked everyone by name, helped gather dropped linens without being asked, and listened with genuine interest whenever someone shared a story about their family. Respect was never demanded. It quietly grew from countless ordinary moments. Even Eleanor Ashford found herself smiling more often than she had in years. One afternoon she remarked to King Lucian, "Your Majesty, this palace feels alive again." Lucian looked across the courtyard where Evelyn knelt beside the children, helping them build small bird feeders from pieces of cedar wood. "It does," he answered softly. "They reminded us that joy returns one kind choice at a time." Not everyone welcomed the change so easily. The noblewoman who had watched Evelyn arrive continued observing from a distance, expecting the newcomer to make a mistake that would justify every doubt she carried. Yet each day brought disappointment instead. Whenever disagreements arose among the servants, Evelyn encouraged calm conversations instead of blame. When one young kitchen helper accidentally ruined an afternoon meal, Evelyn quietly stayed beside her, preparing another without allowing the frightened girl to face humiliation alone. Word of those moments spread naturally through the palace until even the skeptical council members found fewer reasons to object. Elder Marcus finally approached Lucian after the weekly council meeting. His shoulders seemed slightly lower than before, as though pride had become heavier to carry than honesty. "Your Majesty," he admitted, "I believed kindness alone could not guide a kingdom. Perhaps I underestimated how powerful quiet example can become." Lucian nodded with thoughtful understanding. "Strength protects a kingdom," he replied. "Compassion gives it a reason to exist." That evening the palace hosted a gathering for village elders, merchants, craftsmen, and families from across the Blackwood lands. Instead of sitting apart on a raised platform, Lucian invited Evelyn and the children to walk beside him through the great hall, greeting guests one by one. Many recognized the young woman from the forest village. Some remembered receiving help from her years earlier. Others apologized for judging her without knowing her heart. Evelyn accepted every apology with gentle grace, never reminding anyone of their past words. She simply thanked them for coming and encouraged them to enjoy the celebration. As music drifted through the hall and candles filled the room with warm golden light, the three young heirs presented the king with a small wooden frame they had carved together. Inside rested the first drawing they had completed since losing their mother. It showed 4 smiling figures standing beneath tall pine trees, a tall alpha wolf, 3 little pups, and beside them, a young woman with bright hair and kind eyes. Across the bottom, in uneven letters carved with patient determination, were the words, "Home feels warm again." Lucian remained silent for a long moment, touched more deeply than any royal gift had ever managed. He looked toward Evelyn, whose eyes shimmered with quiet emotion as she realized what the children truly meant. They had not forgotten their mother. They had simply found the courage to smile again while carrying her memory with love instead of only sorrow. Lucian carefully placed the wooden frame where every guest could see it. "Let this remain here," he said, "to remind every generation that greatness is not measured by power, wealth, or title. It is measured by the kindness we choose when no one expects it." The great hall fell peacefully silent before warm applause filled every corner of the palace. Even the noblewoman watching from the balcony slowly lowered her eyes, realizing there was nothing she could do against a truth witnessed by an entire kingdom. As winter finally surrendered to spring, flowers began blooming across the palace gardens where bare branches had once stood. Children laughed beneath the same trees that had watched over months of sorrow. Villagers visited the palace without fear. Servants smiled more freely. And whenever travelers asked how Blackwood Kingdom found hope after such a difficult season, the answer was always the same. It began on a freezing night inside a forgotten forest den, where one lonely young woman chose compassion instead of convenience, never imagining that the smallest act of kindness would change the heart of an alpha king, restore 3 grieving children, and remind an entire kingdom that true strength is always gentle, and love has the quiet power to lead even the most broken souls home.